There is a version of the British royal family that the world sees. The coordinated appearances, the practiced smiles, the carefully worded palace statements. Photographs taken from the right angle, released at the right moment, telling the right story. And then there is what actually happens behind those palace walls. Most people will never know the difference. But every so often, something shifts, a decision gets made that cannot be hidden, a tension that has been simmering for years finally boils over in public, and the version of events that was supposed to stay private becomes impossible to contain. The carefully managed image cracks just slightly, and through that crack comes something far more interesting than anything a press secretary ever wrote. This is one of those moments. What happened between Prince William, Queen Camilla, and King Charles was not supposed to play out the way it did. None of the people involved would have chosen for it to unfold publicly, with watching eyes and recording cameras and the entire machinery of royal coverage turning its lens in their direction. But William made a move, deliberate, calculated, and unmistakably bold. And the consequences of that move set off a chain of reactions that left even those closest to the king struggling to find the right words. This is the story of that moment, of what built toward it, of what it cost, and of what it revealed about a family that has always been more complicated than the official version admits. To understand what William did, you have to understand where he was coming from. Not the William who appears at ribbon cuttings and charity events, measured and composed, careful with every public gesture. The William who had spent years watching the institution he would one day inherit make decisions he could not entirely control, absorbing realities about his family that the public never fully grasps, and quietly, methodically, deciding who he intended to be when his moment came. He grew up fast. That is the only real way to say it. The death of his mother, when he was 15 years old, did something to the timeline of his emotional development that no amount of royal privilege could reverse. Grief does not wait for a convenient season. It moves through a person on its own schedule, reshaping what they value and what they will and will not accept long before they have the language to describe what is happening inside them. William learned early that love could disappear without warning, that institutions could fail the people they were supposed to protect, and that the public performance of composure was not the same thing as actually being okay. He watched his father navigate the years following Diana's death with a particular kind of careful distance, and he absorbed that too. The silence, the formality, the way enormous emotional realities could be managed into something presentable. He understood it. He did not necessarily accept it as the only way to live. Catherine came into his life and changed his orientation toward the future. She was not overwhelmed by what she was entering. She was steady in it, grounded in a way that William, for all his preparation, genuinely needed. Their partnership was real. The affection was not performed. And as the years passed and children arrived and his place in the line of succession became less abstract and more imminent, William began to develop a clearer sense of what he would do differently when the time came. The question of Camilla had always been a complicated one for him, not in the loud, declared way that tabloid coverage sometimes implied. William was far too controlled for that kind of open hostility, but in the quieter, more persistent way that complicated truths tend to operate. She had been the figure at the center of his parents' broken marriage. She had been a presence throughout his childhood that required a particular kind of navigation. And then she had become, officially and formally, the queen, his father's choice, an institution unto herself. He was not going to pretend that history did not exist, but he was also not going to let it define every interaction, every decision, every moment of a future that was already complicated enough. William was practical. He understood that the monarchy's survival depended on a kind of internal cohesion that could not afford prolonged personal warfare. He had watched what division did to this family, and he had no interest in repeating it. What he would not do, however, was pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. He would not perform harmony that didn't exist. He would not allow the institution to paper over real cracks with a press release and a joint appearance. The tension that had been building in the months before his bold move was not something that could be traced to a single incident. It was accumulated. There had been disagreements about direction, about how the monarchy should be seen, about what causes it should visibly champion, about how public the private realities of royal life ought to be. Charles, in his new role as king, had his own vision shaped by decades of preparation and by his own particular sense of duty and tradition. Camilla, settling into a role she had waited years to officially occupy, had her own instincts about how influence should operate, quiet and lateral rather than declared. William had his own ideas entirely. He had watched the institution for his entire life. He had seen what worked and what hadn't. He had a generation's worth of different assumptions about transparency, about mental health, about the gap between what public figures said and what people actually believed. He was not willing to be managed into positions he hadn't chosen. He was not willing to let other people's ideas about what the monarchy should look like override his own assessment of what it actually needed to be. The disagreement that pushed things to a breaking point was about something specific, a decision that had been made at the palace level, involving a matter of public positioning that William felt had not accounted for his perspective adequately. The details were kept closely guarded, as such things always are. What was visible was the outcome. William moved. He did not go through the usual channels. He did not route his decision through the communications apparatus, did not seek the sign-offs that would have smoothed the process, but also diluted the message. He acted directly on his own authority in a way that made his position absolutely clear. It was the kind of move that can only be made by someone who has decided they are no longer willing to wait. Someone who has done the calculation and concluded that the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of being heard. William had been doing that calculation for years. The answer had finally shifted. The palace found out before Charles did. That detail alone was significant. It meant William had moved fast enough and quietly enough that the internal machinery of royal management had not had time to intervene. By the time the situation landed on the king's desk, the move had already been made. The moment for quiet course correction had already passed. Charles's reaction was not, by any account, what anyone would describe as comfortable. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life operating within structures of protocol and managed communication, who understood the monarchy as something that required careful tending, where every action sent signals that rippled outward in ways that had to be anticipated. His son had just acted in a way that bypassed all of that. Not in anger, not in rebellion, but with a calm, deliberate intention that was somehow harder to respond to than outright conflict would have been. You can argue with rage. It is much harder to argue with clarity. What made the moment even more charged was that Camilla had known. Not about the specifics. William had kept those tight, but about the general direction of William's thinking. There had been conversations between them, less adversarial than many people would have expected, more honest than official versions of their relationship might suggest. Camilla had her own understanding of where things stood. She had her own long history of navigating a family that did not always say out loud what it was actually feeling. When William made his move, she did not respond the way Charles responded. She did not move toward containment. She did something that the people watching very closely described, in carefully chosen words, as measured acknowledgement, a response that neither fully endorsed what William had done nor positioned itself against it, a response that held space. In the language of this family, in the architecture of how things are communicated without being said, that was its own kind of declaration. And Charles, reading that response, understood immediately what it meant. His wife had not closed ranks behind him in the way he might have expected. She had not dismissed his son's move as overreach. She had, in her own quiet way, signaled that she understood why William had done what he did. The room that held all three of them, metaphorically, in the sense of the situation they now all occupied, became something no protocol had been designed to manage. William was 30-something years old, the father of 3 children, the future king, and he had just made visible something that the family had been collectively, carefully not saying for years. He had decided that the not saying was no longer serving anyone. He stood by what he'd done. He did not apologize for it. He did not soften it with the diplomatic language that royal life had trained into everyone around him for birth. He let it sit clear and legible, and he waited to see what happened next. What happened next would change the internal geography of the British royal family in ways that are still, even now, working themselves out. The palace corridors that had seen centuries of succession politics, of marriages and deaths and abdications and wars had seen something new that day. Not a scandal, not a rebellion. Something more unsettling than either of those in some ways. A son who had decided to be honest, and a stepmother who had decided, in her response, to be something no one had quite anticipated either. Charles stood at the center of it, surrounded by people who loved him and who had still, in their separate and individual ways, chosen something other than what he had expected them to choose. That is the thing about bold moves in families. They don't just change the person who makes them. They reveal everyone else, too. They surface the things that have been sitting quietly beneath the official version, waiting for exactly this kind of moment to become visible. William had given this moment its visibility. What came next was no longer entirely his to control. There's a particular kind of silence that settles inside a palace after something has been said that cannot be unsaid. It is not peaceful silence. It does not resemble the quiet of an empty room or the stillness of early morning. It is the silence of people choosing their words with extreme care, of conversations being had in fragments across different hallways, of staff members reading the room and adjusting their behavior accordingly, of everyone waiting to see who would move first. That was the silence that followed William's move. The palace, as an institution, is exceptionally good at managing public-facing crises. It has had centuries of practice. There are people employed specifically to handle the gap between what has happened and what the world is told about what has happened, and they're skilled at their work. Press lines get crafted. Timings get managed. The story gets shaped before it can shape itself. What the palace is less equipped for is managing something that happens entirely inside the family. Something that never becomes a formal crisis because it never makes it into a headline. Something that sits in the rooms between the official rooms and slowly reconfigures the relationships that everyone else depends on staying stable. This was that kind of thing. In the days that followed, the senior royals and their respective households moved carefully around each other. Not with hostility. That would have been easier, in some ways, more legible, more resolvable. With that specific calibrated distance that people in complicated families develop when they need to share space while they are still deciding how they feel about what has just happened. Charles, to those who knew him, was managing something that went deeper than disagreement. It touched the older wound, the longer story, the years of waiting to be king, the weight of expectation and duty, the constant effort to hold together a family that had been cracking in different directions for decades. He had believed, in the way that fathers believe things about their children in spite of all available evidence, that when the moment came, William would ultimately defer. Not because William lacked the spine to do otherwise, but because Charles genuinely could not see, until the moment arrived, how fully formed William's own convictions had become. He was looking at his son and seeing, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that the man across from him was not waiting for his inheritance. He was already operating from a place of complete certainty about who he was and what he stood for. That was not, it turned out, easy for a father to absorb, even a father who is a king. Perhaps especially a father who is a king. Camilla's position in all of this was the variable no one had quite accounted for, including, it seemed, Camilla herself. She had spent years becoming fluent in the politics of this family, learning how to occupy the space she'd been given without either shrinking from it or overreaching in a territory that wasn't hers to claim. She had made herself useful, made herself stable, made herself, against considerable odds, something close to accepted. It had required an enormous amount of work and patience and a very particular kind of intelligence, the kind that reads rooms and people, and long-term consequences rather than short-term advantages. When William had made his move, she had felt the pull of two different loyalties at once. Her loyalty to Charles was genuine, complicated by history, but made real by the years they had built together. Her loyalty to the institution was equally real. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what was at stake if the monarchy's internal fractures became too wide to manage. But there was something else, something she had not expected to feel as strongly as she did. A kind of recognition. She had spent so much of her own life navigating systems and expectations that did not entirely account for who she actually was, performing a version of herself that fit within allowable parameters while the fuller, more complicated person beneath waited for conditions that might never fully arrive. She had made her peace with that. It was simply the reality of the life she had chosen and been chosen into. But she had made that peace from the inside. She knew what it cost. She knew what it looked like from the outside when someone decided they were no longer willing to pay that particular cost. William's move had that quality to it. Not the quality of a temper tantrum or a power play. The quality of someone who had been patient for a very long time and had finally decided that patience, in this specific instance, was no longer the right instrument. She respected it. She could not entirely say so to Charles, but she respected it. Her response, the measured, careful response that had stunned observers, had been deliberate. She was too experienced, too aware of consequences to act without calculation. But what she had calculated was not how to best support her husband's position. What she had calculated was how to remain honest without causing irreparable damage. How to hold space for William's truth without making Charles feel abandoned. How to be, in a family that had very little practice with this, something close to fair. It was a harder calculation than it looked. In the private conversations that followed, not the formal meetings with advisors and press secretaries, but the quieter ones in the evenings with fewer people in the room, the real negotiations happened. William was not triumphant. He was not gloating over having made a move that had shaken the hierarchy. He was serious about this, which meant he was also serious about not letting it become a rupture that couldn't be repaired. He cared about his father. The love between them was real, even when the dynamic between them was fraught. He had not moved to hurt Charles. He had moved because he had reached the point where not moving was a kind of dishonesty he could no longer practice. He sat with his father in a room without advisors and said, in the particular language of two people who have a complicated history and are trying to navigate it honestly, what he had been trying to say for years. Not accusations, not grievances, something harder to manage than either of those. A clear account of his own position, his own vision, his own assessment of what the institution needed to do to survive in the world he could see coming. Charles listened. He was underneath everything a man who had always cared deeply about legacy and continuity, about doing right by the thing he had been given responsibility for. He could not always separate his personal feelings from his institutional ones. That was perhaps his greatest ongoing challenge. But when his son laid out a vision for the future that was thoughtful and principled, and Charles had to admit, not entirely wrong, something in the older man shifted. Not capitulation, not defeat, something more like recognition. The son who had once needed him was now someone with standing to share the weight. Someone who had developed through the very trials that had shaped him and broken him and rebuilt him, a kind of authority that did not come from titles or protocol. It came from exactly the kind of hard experience that had built this family's capacity for endurance across generations, and it was now sitting across the table from Charles in the form of his own firstborn child. It was a profound moment. It was also an uncomfortable one. Those two things coexisted. Camilla, who was present for some of these conversations and strategically absent from others, continued to do what she did with characteristic subtlety. She did not push. She did not broker loudly. She created conditions, small conversational openings, subtle reframings, the occasional well-placed observation that allowed both men to hear each other more clearly than they might have managed on their own. This was her particular skill, honed over decades of navigating a family that was not always easy to love and not always easy to be loved by. She had not arrived in this family as a savior or a villain, regardless of the narratives attached to either of those roles. She had arrived as a person with her own history and her own capacity for navigating complexity, and she had been applying that capacity steadily, without fanfare, ever since. What she did now was the same thing she had always done. She looked at the real situation, not the press version, not the protocol version, not the version that served any particular agenda, and she responded to that. The real situation was a family at a generational inflection point. A king navigating the tension between the authority he held and the authority his heir was already claiming. A prince who had decided that the future he was inheriting deserved honesty more than it deserved performance. A woman positioned between them who had spent her entire life in precisely this kind of crossroads, making the best decisions she could with the tools available to her. She had made her choice about what kind of response this moment required. It had not been the easy choice. It had not been the politically convenient one. It had been, in the quiet way she operated, the honest one. And Charles, watching his wife hold space for his son in a way that he found both surprising and, eventually, clarifying, was left with a feeling he did not have immediate language for. Not betrayal. Not that. Something more like the experience of seeing two people he loved clearly, perhaps more clearly than he had allowed himself to before, and discovering that their clarity had something to teach him. He was the king. He was the father. He was the husband. He was a man in his mid-70s who had waited his entire life for the role he now held, and who was, in this specific season, being asked to be all of those things at once while navigating a family crisis that had no precedent in the official handbook. He was also, underneath all of that, someone who had known loss and complicated love and the weight of expectations that could not always be met. Someone who understood, from the inside, what it felt like to be caught between what an institution required and what a human being actually needed. That understanding did not resolve everything. It did not eliminate the tension or repair every crack. But it created the possibility of conversation, a real one, not a managed one, that the family had perhaps been waiting years to have. The silence that had followed William's move began, slowly, to change its quality. Not to disappear, not to resolve into anything as simple as peace, but to become the kind of silence that precedes real speech rather than the kind that buries it. Something was shifting inside Buckingham Palace and the other great houses of the monarchy in the relationships that held it together and the understandings that had governed it for decades. The shift had been set in motion by a son who had decided to be bold, amplified by a stepmother who had decided to be honest, and was now working its way into the consciousness of a king who was discovering, at a late stage, in a season of his life that allowed less room for comfortable illusions, that the people around him were more complicated and more worthy of his full attention than the official version of his family had required him to acknowledge. That was the thing about William's move. It had not just created a crisis. It had created an opening. Small, uncertain, ringed around by the defensive habits and long histories that this family had accumulated over a lifetime of managing itself in public. But real. And in a family like this one, in an institution with this kind of weight and history, a real opening, however uncomfortable, however earn at great cost, is not a small thing. It is sometimes the only thing. The thing about the British monarchy that most people do not fully grasp, even those who follow it closely, is that it does not change quickly. It is built structurally and culturally to resist change. Its entire justification for existing is rooted in continuity, the idea that some things persist across generations, across governments, across the churning chaos of history, offering a kind of stable thread that connects the past to the present and implies a future. That is the argument for the institution. That is also why changing it from the inside is one of the most difficult things a person can attempt. William knew this. He had grown up inside it. He had absorbed the weight of that continuity in his body from the time he was old enough to be placed in front of cameras and taught to wave. He understood, better than perhaps any outsider could, what the machinery was and how deeply it ran. He had not made his bold move out of ignorance about what he was pushing against. He had made it fully aware, which was what made it so significant. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, the initial shock began to settle into something more workable. Not comfortable, not resolved, but workable in the way that families, even massively complicated ones operating under the scrutiny of an entire nation, sometimes find a footing after a serious collision. The full emotional reckoning had not yet happened. In this family, full emotional reckonings tend to move very slowly, spread across years and seasons, emerging piece by piece rather than in one clean conversation, but the acute phase was passing. Charles had, with characteristic determination, redirected his energy toward his duties. That was his mechanism, his lifelong tool for managing what could not yet be resolved. Put the work in front of you and do it. Let the doing be its own form of stability when everything else feels uncertain. He attended to his engagements. He read his briefings. He conducted his audiences. He was the king, and being the king, done with commitment and discipline, was the thing he knew how to do. But those who spent time with him noted something changed in those weeks. Not dramatic, not visible in photographs or official footage. Subtler than that, a quality of presence that had shifted slightly, as if a layer of automatic assumption had been removed, and something more open, more uncertain, more human had emerged beneath it. He was thinking about his son differently, working something out, allowing himself to sit with a discomfort that he might, in earlier years, have converted more quickly into resolution. He was, in his own way, responding to what had happened. Slowly, imperfectly, in the way that men of his generation and background and training tend to process the things that matter most, sideways, in action rather than speech, through gestures and choices and the subtle renegotiation of how space gets shared. There was one afternoon, not widely reported and only known through the accounts of those present, when Charles sought William out specifically, not for a formal meeting, not with advisors present, just the two of them, in the way that fathers and sons sometimes manage briefly to meet without the weight of their entire history crowding out the actual conversation. What passed between them stayed between them, as it should, but the people who saw them separately afterward reported that something had shifted in both men. Not healed, not resolved, but shifted. A small acknowledgement had been made. Some piece of truth had been allowed to be true out loud, between the two of them, without the institution having to manage it into an acceptable shape first. It was not reconciliation in any cinematic sense. Real family dynamics never are. But it was a beginning of something. A first, careful step toward a relationship that acknowledged who both men actually were rather than who their respective roles required them to be. Camilla watched this process with the particular attention she applied to everything in this family. Closely, carefully, without advertising the closeness of her observation. She had her own ongoing recalibration to manage. Her response in the immediate aftermath of William's move had said something about who she was and what she valued, and that saying had consequences she was now navigating. Charles had not been angry with her. Exactly. He understood why she had responded the way she had, even when that understanding was painful. But things between them had entered a more complex register. Conversations that had previously moved on the surface were now going slightly deeper, touching edges of things they had been managing around for years. This was not unwelcome to her. She had been in this marriage long enough, and she knew Charles well enough to understand that genuine complexity was not the enemy of love. Some relationships thrive specifically in the places where easy answers fail. Theirs was one of those, had been from the beginning, had survived decades on the basis of something that was not simple and was not comfortable, but was real in a way that more comfortable things sometimes aren't. What her response to William's move had done was introduce a new kind of honesty into their dynamic. She had shown him a piece of her judgment that she did not always make visible. Her capacity to see clearly even when seeing clearly complicated her own position. He was processing that. So was she. It changed the conversations they were having, made room for things that had previously been understood but not spoken. That process was ongoing, built into the daily texture of their life together, moving at the pace of two people who had been through a great deal and were not in a hurry to perform resolution they hadn't earned. For William, the weeks that followed his move brought a different kind of aftermath. He had made his position clear, but clarity does not automatically translate into the outcomes that motivated it. The palace machinery was still in place. The structures he had challenged still had mass and momentum. Change, inside an institution like this one, is rarely a single bold act followed by a visible shift. It is a slow pressure applied consistently from within against walls that were built to resist exactly this kind of pressure. He understood that. He had not expected a different result. He had made his move because the alternative, continuing to operate within a framework that felt fundamentally misaligned with his own understanding of what the monarchy needed to be, had become untenable. The move itself was the thing. What came next would require continued effort, continued willingness to hold his position, continued patience with a process that did not move quickly. He had Catherine beside him through all of this, as she had been through every difficult stretch of their shared life. She was not a peripheral figure in his navigation of these events. She was central to it, in the way that a deeply trusted partner becomes central to everything that matters. She had her own clarity about the situation, her own instincts about how it should be handled, and the wisdom to know when to speak those instincts and when to simply be present. She was, in this as in everything, the ballast, the steady thing. Their household moved forward with a sense of intention that those close to them described as focused, not combative. William was not in a combative posture about any of this, but purposeful. He knew what he was building toward. He knew what he believed about the future of the institution he would one day lead. He was working toward that future not by waiting for it to arrive, but by acting where he could in alignment with it now. The public, watching all of this from outside, saw only the official surfaces, the appearances, the coordinated photographs, the palace statements, the careful choreography of royal public life proceeding, as it always does, with its practiced and reassuring regularity. They saw a family that looked from the outside the same as it always had. They cannot see the real story. They rarely can. The real story of any family, royalty or otherwise, is lived in the spaces between the visible moments, in the private conversations, and the deliberate silences, in the small gestures that carry enormous weight, in the slow and difficult work of people who share a history, trying to figure out how to share a future. That work was happening in every quiet room where Charles sat with his thoughts, in every honest exchange between William and his father, in every careful move Camilla made to hold space for the people she loved without betraying herself in the process. What William had done by acting boldly was not simply create a crisis. He had created a pressure, the kind of pressure that families sometimes need in order to become something truer than what they were. He had made it impossible to continue pretending that everything was fine, and in doing so, he had made it possible for something more honest to start being built in the space that pretending had been occupying. Camilla's response had amplified that pressure, had added a dimension to it that Charles had not anticipated and could not simply dismiss. Her measured acknowledgement had been, in its way, its own kind of boldness, the boldness of a woman who had spent so much of her life in survival mode, navigating external hostility and internal complexity, choosing in this moment to respond not from self-protection, but from something more principled. Together, their moves had created a situation where Charles, the king, the father, the husband, could no longer entirely operate from the comfortable position of institutional authority and paternal expectation. He was being asked by the people he loved most and who knew him most completely to be different, to see differently, to engage with the complicated truth of his family rather than the managed version of it. He was not there yet. He might never fully arrive. People of his age and formation rarely make radical internal shifts, and no one who knew him expected him to become someone else. But he was in motion. That was the thing that those who watched closely could see, even if the motion was slow and halting and occasionally went sideways before it went forward. He was in motion. The British monarchy has survived things that should have destroyed it. Scandals and wars and abdications and the death of beloved figures and the relentless modern pressure of transparency and scrutiny. It has survived because the people inside it, whatever their flaws and complications, have generally managed to find ways to keep moving forward, to absorb shocks and adapt and continue. This moment was one more test of that capacity. Not the most dramatic test in the institution's history. Not the kind of thing that makes headlines in the way that crises tend to. But a real test played out in real rooms between real people who were genuinely trying, in their separate and imperfect ways, to figure out how to be a family and an institution at the same time. William had been bold. Camilla had been honest. Charles had been stunned. And then, because this is what this family does, because this is what people do, they kept going. Through the difficulty, through the discomfort, through the slow and unglamorous work of finding a new footing on ground that had shifted. The story was not finished. Stories like this one never really finish. They evolve, become something different, get handed forward to the next generation to carry and navigate in their own way. What William had started would continue in forms that no one could entirely predict. The conversations that had been opened would keep opening. The honesty that had been introduced would keep working its way through the system. That is the nature of bold moves made from conviction rather than impulse. They do not end when the act is complete. They begin there. And somewhere inside Buckingham Palace and in the houses and working lives of the people who make up this complicated, famous, very human family, something new was finding its shape. Not without cost. Not without difficulty. Not in the clean, resolved way that stories are supposed to end, but finding its shape. That is enough. In a family this complicated, with a history this heavy, and a future this uncertain, that is more than enough. That is, in fact, everything.